My wife is going to hate it, George Clooney had said. And what is he talking about? Has he crashed the family car? Has he broken some precious gift given as a wedding present to him and his wife? Has he been fired from his job? Has he accidentally poured weed killer onto the well-manicured lawn rather than feed her? What has he done that he has said, my wife is going to hate this? He has dyed his hair. And he argues that an older person, man, dyeing his hair looks even older. And perhaps this assertion gives us some insight into one of the gods of our society, the God of appearance, the God of health and beauty, the God of outward looks. We come to our text this evening in verse 3 of Exodus chapter 20. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, we commonly divide the Ten Commandments into two major parts. A division followed in our shorter catechism based on the common book of prayer. The first 4 commands directed of our duty towards God. The second 6 commands describing our duty towards one another. Packer develops that division, I think, in a helpful way, and he includes into those 2 divisions the 3 actions of thoughts and words and deeds. And so he delineates or he describes the 2 sections in this way. So in commands 1 and 2 we have thoughts. In commands 3 we have words. In command 4, we have deeds. And then he jumps 5 and comes to 6 to 8 as deeds, 9 is words, and 10, you shall not covet, is thoughts. And so it goes thoughts, words, deeds, and then deeds, words, thoughts, leaving commandment 5 about the family at the very center. And Packer, having analysed a whole range of divisions of the 10 Commandments, considers this to be most significant because in God's purpose, the family is at the centre of all living. We live to God, we live to our society, but at the very heart of our lives is our family, set here at the very heart of the 10 Commandments. But however we divide the 10 Commandments, all commentaries are agreed on this point, that the first one is foundational to all the rest. You shall have no other gods before me. We want to think this evening about having the right priorities. You shall have no other gods. What does this statement mean? And it will challenge our minds to try and grasp what it means. Does it mean there are other gods then? You shall have no other gods before me. Is it recognizing that there are other gods, but they are just not to be beside or before the living and the true God? What is being asserted here? Well, some commentators, and rightly, point out that there are other gods mentioned in Scripture, true and legitimate gods. So we read, for example, in Psalm 8, that the angels are described as Elohim, or God. He made them a little lower than the angels. They are described by this word that's used in the Old Testament for God. In Psalm 82, in verse 6, rulers are described by this same word for God. I said, you are gods, the children of the Most High. So in certain senses, angels and rulers are described as gods. So this commandment, it can be understood as recognizing the existence of angels and of rulers, but they are to have a subservient place. The church in Colossae was plagued with the temptation of worshipping angels. This command is against that. Daniel, when he was in exile, was tempted with placing the king above the commands of God. This command was against that. You shall have no other gods before me. A different way to understand this phrase is by understanding it of false gods. So there are gods who are worshipped by Egypt, the god Ammon, principally, a god worshipped by Babylon, the god Marduk, principally, though they worshipped other gods to keep them happy as well. So this command was spoken against the nation that they had just come from. You shall have no other gods. You shall not devote yourself to them. You shall not follow their principles. You shall not worship them. I am the living and true God whom you are to worship. The phrase then, in this sense, is to be understood as those other objects of worship being called gods and treated as gods. It is not legitimizing the fact that they actually exist. Paul speaks of this, doesn't he, in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 4. He says, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or in earth, yet for us there is one God. So when this commandment uses the word gods here, it's using it as the apostle interpreted it in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 4 of so-called gods. They weren't real. They couldn't speak. They couldn't change the course of history. Only one God can do that. But in the mind of the people, in the devotion of the people, they were being treated as God. Marduk, Ammon, Baal, they were classed and treated as God. So this command is saying, you shall have no other false gods in your heart, in your life, in your object of worship. And then a third sense is the one that probably challenges us most and closest, is those things in our life which control us and dominate us. Take up all our thought, take up all our possessions, take up all our time, take up all our heart and our love, which take the place of God. And this command is speaking against them. Luther defines it as whatever your heart clings to and relies on, that is properly your God. Commonly within our society, things like self and money and power are the gods in many people's lives. People only think of themselves. They only think of getting power, keeping power, using power. They only think of amassing wealth in their experience. These are gods. The Bible speaks of how wrong and corrupting that approach is. Pride comes before a fall, a domination with ourself. Money is the root of all kinds of evil, a pursuit of that God. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This command is speaking against other gods, whether it's angels, whether it's false gods, whether it's those gods that can take over our heart, our life, our mind. You shall have no other gods. The relevance of this command is powerful for us, isn't it, in our time? On one level, it's so powerful in speaking into this recent fascination with angelology in our society. That the rise of belief in angelology is increasing and belief in God is plummeting. This command is speaking into this current trend in the United Kingdom. You shall have no other gods before me. Just last month, Kylie Gray has published a book on angelology. Angels Are With You Now is the title. It reaches to 240 pages. It's had over 150 reviews, giving it 4.8 stars out of 5. It goes into the history of angelology and different religions. It identifies how you can discern the presence of an angel, how you can come to understand the role of a guardian angel. This is where our society is and is increasingly going. A denial of and an ignorance of God's existence, but a penchant for angelology. This command is speaking into that displacing of God. For his creation and his creatures, you shall have no other gods. It speaks into the false gods of our time, doesn't it? In the time of this command being written, polytheism was the challenge to God's people. The gods that were there in Egypt, Marduk, and then the other gods whom they subscribed to and followed just in case, to keep them happy, to avert their wrath from their nation. And then, as they were moving into the promised land, surrounded by a whole new range of gods and nations, what temptation was there, how pertinent this command was for them. You shall have no other gods. As Hinduism increases within our own nation and Islam advances within our own time, this command is increasingly more relevant to us. Worship the God of the Bible. Worship the living and the true God. The God of Mount Sinai, the God of Calvary. You shall have no other gods before me. The challenge for our lives and our society as we wrestle with the gods which tempt us and vie for that place that we're seeking to give to the living and true God in our hearts. That battle that we face daily to keep Jesus on the throne of our lives, to give him the first place in our decisions, in our devotions, in our interests, to try to honor him in all that we do. What a conflict we have. And one writer helpfully sets out that the range of prominent gods there have been to challenge God's people over the centuries. In the time of the classics, classic philosophers like Cicero, they recognized the presence of different gods to challenge virtue within their society. Sex, shekels, and stomach were the dominant gods in that time. In the first century, the Apostle John identifies the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life as being dominant gods and challengers to the kingship of Jesus in our hearts. And latterly, one writer suggests football, the firm, and the family are challenges in many of our lives to Jesus Christ being Lord in our life. This command is so relevant to us, challenging us to have the right priorities in our living. You shall have no other gods. And we fail and we come to Jesus for cleansing, forgiveness, and strength to try and follow him closer. The second emphasis, I think, in this command is having the right proportions. Having the right proportions, and we're fastening our attention on this end phrase, before me. Have no other gods before me. And we're wrestling with this question then, what has been set out for us here? What are we allowed to have? What place is to be given to legitimate issues in our life? There is a legitimate place for money and for power and for interest in ourselves. But it's having the right proportion. It's having them in their proper place that this command is directing us and challenging us to have no other gods before me. The phrase can be translated in my face or against me. It is or near to me in chapter 49, verse 30 of Genesis. It's the idea of them being near to a location. And this command then is saying, don't have other challenges to my lordship close to me. Any legitimate issues in our lives are to be subservient to the living and the true God. In chapter 20 and verse 20, the phrase is translated against you or even in your face. It's this idea of rivalry, of our affections being torn, of our worship and devotion being directed away from the living and true God, not always by something that is wrong and evil and sinful, but even by something that in its other place, its lower place, is legitimate and beneficial and necessary. It was a challenge for Jacob in his life. And there was a time in his life where he worshipped the living and true God, but his family had idols among their possessions. And God challenged him about this, and Jacob responded to that challenge, and he buried those idols away from sight. It was a challenge which Israel faced at this very moment, because the model of neighboring countries like Egypt was to have one supreme God, Ammon, but then worship other lesser gods. It was a battle that Israel would have right throughout the divided kingdom. They would worship God, but also worship others, as Solomon did, and many of his successors followed his example. It's a challenge for us to have the right proportions of things which are legitimate and right and honourable and useful and necessary in their life, but not to allow them to blow up and expand beyond the place which they ought to have as servants of Christ and disciples of the Lord Jesus. Jen Wilkins, in her book, mentions this battle between the both and mentality instead of that single-minded allegiance to God. She talks about, I need God and I need a spouse. I need God and I need good health. I need God and I need a well-padded bank balance. All of those things are good and legitimate and honourable, but not when they supplant the place of God. Have no other gods beside me, challenging me in my face, taking the rivalry away. Solomon went wrong there, didn't he, in his life, as he sought fulfillment and joy and advancement through focusing on those things which in another proportion would be legitimate. He went after wisdom. He went after riches. He went after work. He went after pleasure. Things which in a lower sphere and a lesser proportion were acceptable and enjoyable. But he expanded them to fill his life and displace his worship and honor of God. And so constantly we read in those chapters, Ecclesiastes 1 to 3, life is empty. Life is unfulfilling. He displaced God, and in doing that, he set aside the true and proper object of his worship. One writer suggests that as we place God first in his legitimate position, we will find greater joy and delight in everything else. Have you found that if you're into sport, recording the event or watching it the next day, having kept the Sabbath day? Perhaps a project you're involved in your workplace, and there's pressure on you to finish this. But you suspended it to worship God on the Sabbath day, and then with greater clarity and energy, you fulfill that project. To have the right proportions in our life, to include those other items, those legitimate, honorable, enjoyable, necessary items in our experience, but to have them in a lesser plane. And have no other gods besides me, rivaling devotion to me. And then thirdly, it brings us then to the positive angle of this. Let us have right passion. You shall have no other gods, which indicates that we are to give ourselves wholeheartedly to loving and following the living and true God. The cast in which many of the commandments is in a negative cast, isn't it? The negative is set before us, what we should not do. And Alec Mottier puts an interesting take on this, that actually this is more liberating for us than if we were told what we should do. And he illustrates this from Genesis chapter 2 and God's prohibition to Adam and Eve: you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of the good and evil. And that negative prohibition gave them great liberty, gave them great scope to eat of every other tree of the garden. And so in considering the negative commands of the Ten Commandments, that there is that dimension that actually is providing tremendous liberty for us by our gracious and wise God. And here in this one, you shall have no other gods before me. It's directing us to allegiance to the one God, the living God, the true God. It's stated for us in the positive in that well-known passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the position we're to seek to give our God. And as we love our God in that way and seek after and aspire after loving him in that way, his laws, his ways, his example, his grace, his promises, as we place them dominant in our minds and in our hearts, then other things that are legitimate and necessary and important in our lives will all be molded and savored by that principal object of our worship. Jen Wilkins suggests that in God's providence in our life, one of the things which often points out the folly of having other gods is a crisis. And a crisis in God's providence often shows us where we've been going wrong. She suggests a financial crisis teaches us the folly of worshipping money. A wayward child teaches us the folly of worshipping family. The aging process teaches us the folly of worshipping health and beauty. A crisis in God's providence in our life brings us again from those gods which might have grown in our hearts to the feet of the living and true God. In our denomination, we have help in understanding what the positive in this commandment is in our shorter and in our larger catechism. And I summarize for you the answer in the larger catechism, what is required in this commandment. And it sets out an eightfold response, a response which is worthy of our consideration and reflection as we think of this first commandment in our life. It talks about us having no other gods by knowing the living and true God, by worshipping the only living and true God, by believing the living and true God, by trusting in the living and true God, by a zeal for the commands and ways of the living and true God, by calling upon him in prayer and worship, by pleasing him in the priorities and choices of our life, by seeking to walk humbly with God. Having this passion for the one living and true God. So this command seeks to direct us in having the right priorities. You shall have no other gods. Seek to direct us in having the right proportions. You shall have no other gods besides me. And then seeks to show us that we're to have the right passions in devoting ourselves to the living and true God. It comes on the back of God's assertion of redemption and revelation that we thought of in verses 1 and 2, the prelude, the build-up, the prologue to this. It's joined onto this God of redemption, God who speaks to us, God who enters into covenant with us. And it's this God who's saying to us, a God who loves us. You shall have no other gods before me. And as we become fascinated with this God, as we understand his greatness, but also his love and his grace to us, this should help us to respond to him in devotion and gratitude. I had to give part of a tribute to one of our ministers, and I didn't know much about his ministry in a certain part of the west of Ireland, and so I wrote to the clerk of the congregation seeking some information, and he assigned a member to write her memories of the minister's time there. And one of the things she included in her letter was her memory of seeing the minister leave the church building and walk across the car park on the last day of his ministry with him. And she wrote that in her heart she wondered if anyone would love them as much again. And that's our thought about God. Can anyone love us as much? He's redeemed us. And it's that loving, redeeming God that says to us, put me first. There's no one loves you as much as I do. Put me first in your life.